Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part 2 as we look at the first portion of Judaism and some key terms and concepts. And we left off here, with the Bible. We think of it as a solid book, but it's actually a collection of books. It's its name in Greek, Biblios. And that the Bible, as we would conceive it, perhaps more so with the Christian scriptures than the Jewish, but essentially with the canon of St. Athanasius of Alexandria, in 367 CE in his Easter letter, where it's, at that point, like what we could say, hold in our hand, this collection of books would be with Athanasius of Alexandria's Easter letter canon that essentially carried on throughout the Christian world. Well, we have no autographs or first editions of any of the books of the Bible. We only have copies. I mentioned in the previous lecture video about how John of Patmos was trying to scare a particular group of individuals with that warning. Well, whom he was trying to scare was copyists. This is what is known in textual studies as redaction criticism. Redaction refers to, a copyist, an editor. Well, you can see differences in the Bible when you go from the earliest manuscripts that we have available to the later manuscripts, where copyists change things. Sometimes they did so by accident. They wrote something down wrong by mistake. But other times with intent, that, this is written horribly and I can do a much better job, that kind of thing. And like I said, you can see this when, you go from the earliest manuscripts that we have available to later manuscripts. In the case, with John of Patmos, the author of the book of Revelation, he was not successful in trying to scare people from doing this. Just to give, one example, you have within the book of Revelation the whole 616, or excuse me, not 616, but 666. But you have other manuscripts of the book of Revelation that have the number at 616. But to give perhaps a better example, the earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark ends with an empty tomb. And then later manuscripts have what we call the longer ending of Mark, where Jesus appears before his disciples and mentions how you'll be able to pick up, serpents and nothing will be able to harm you, etc. Well, that's not found in the earliest manuscripts that we have of Mark. Now, I've told my students, when we've discussed the New Testament courses, that, what we would call the longer ending of Mark, if a group of individuals, finds something to be canonical or divinely inspired, it doesn't really matter when it was written. It doesn't matter if it was written, today or 1,000 years ago. That won't change that fact. But it's not part of the earliest manuscripts that we do have of Mark. And to kind of say something with that, the earliest manuscripts that we have of the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians would call the Old Testament, the earliest manuscripts we have there date from about 300 BCE or BC. In terms of the Christian scriptures, also called the New Testament, the earliest manuscripts we have there, at least a complete copy, would be the 4th century. We do have a tiny fragment of the Gospel of John, which dates to the early 2nd century, about the year 125 CE or AD, but it's just a tiny fragment. It's not the full manuscript of John. But the goal that historians have is to try to get back to the autographs as much as possible before copyists, change things, whether they did so by accident or whether they did so by intent. To give one, more example of this, and this is, me personally, I would not be surprised if we find a copy of the book of Genesis older than what we currently have. I would not be surprised if chapter 2 of the book of Genesis is missing. And a big reason why is because it's more detailed. It makes me think that when somebody was copying Genesis, the copyist felt, this is just not done properly, and I can do it better. And you have two different stories of creation there, going from chapter 1 to chapter 2, and chapter 2 is more detailed, and I'd say a big reason why is because a copyist thought he could do a better job, he or she. Now, of course, until we find a manuscript of the book of Genesis older than we currently have, we can't actually prove that, but I just suspect that to be the case based on the rhetoric between the two. But continuing on, in the case of the books of the Bible, we are not for certain who many of the authors of those books truly were. And let me have a little bit of a sip of water here, and I'll focus on this point. There is whom this particular work is ascribed, to being from. But when you start to wonder about these individuals, and also when you consider the rhetoric, it begins to make you wonder, if this person is actually the author of this particular work. Just for one, the majority of the world, when these works were written, the majority of people they were illiterate. So you have that there, but let's give, a couple of examples for this. Take the Gospel of Matthew, which is ascribed to Matthew the tax collector, Jesus' disciple, Jesus' apostle Matthew. Have you ever wondered why it is written from a third-person perspective? Even Matthew's own call to conversion is written from a third-person perspective. While it's certainly possible that some of the Gospel of Matthew goes back to the person whom it's named after, in its final form, we just don't know who actually wrote it. Or take the Apostle Paul. Traditionally speaking, there are 14 letters in the canonical New Testament that are attributed to Paul. Contemporary historians question Paul being the author of half of them. And a main reason why is because the rhetoric changes in those works. And in the case with one of the letters, which would be the letter to the Hebrews, Paul's authorship has pretty much been entirely removed there, and this would come even from very conservative historians. Within the early Christian world, Christians essentially convinced themselves that Paul was the author of that letter. Origen of Alexandria, who was a presbyter/priest in Alexandria, was posthumously condemned for a lot of his views, but some of his works have stayed on by people who copied them. One of them being Eusebius, the early church historian. And when Eusebius quotes Origen, he mentions how Origen in his letter regarding Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews, Origen makes the statement that whomever really wrote the letter, God only knows. I mean, he mentions that Paul is who it's ascribed to, but he mentions how the language is so much different from, someone that declared himself to be, not so good in speech, etc., etc. But anyway, I also mention that, if a group of people consider something to be canonical or divinely inspired, it doesn't really matter, when the work was written or whom actually wrote it. That wouldn't change that point. And another point to mention here is that for the Jewish people, the most important portion of the Hebrew Bible, which is commonly referred to as the Tanakh, Christians will refer to these works as the Old Testament, would be the Torah/Law/Pentateuch, which is relating to 5, but basically Genesis through Deuteronomy. Might as well mention that the word Tanakh, it's shorthand there for Torah or law, and then the N would be Navim, which would be the prophetic/historical books, and then K, Ketuvim, referring to writings. Within Hebrew, there are no vowels, so vowels are basically placed in from other languages. Often at times the Abrahamic God is referred to as Yahweh, and this comes from how the tentagram, as it would be, is translated with the vowels being added in, but you'll sometimes also see it as Jehovah, and again that relates to, the vowels coming in, and also I would say with Jehovah it's going from, different languages, German and English and whatnot, but in any case, it's referring to the same being, God of Abraham. But, again, for the Jewish people, their most important portion of the Hebrew Bible, they do not use the term Old Testament, that's a Christian term, would be the Torah/Law/Pentateuch, essentially Genesis through Deuteronomy. The other portions of the Hebrew Bible, yeah, they're important, but they don't carry the same amount of weight as the Torah or Law. The historical books like the King books, or the writings like the Book of Psalms, or the book of Wisdom, or, the Proverbs, yeah, they're important, or the Book of Job, they're important, but they don't carry the same amount of weight as the Torah or Law. Just to say, something more with that, I don't see too many of these bracelets or even this jewelry anymore, but when I've stated this before in the past, I've had others comment on what I'm talking about, so I assume that it's still around. But I used to see Christians wearing bracelets and having jewelry with the initials WWJD, what would Jesus do? Well, the Jewish people that do not share a belief in Jesus, and I will mention something about that later on, but to kind of compete with them, they would have, jewelry that would have the lettering of WDTS. What does Torah say? And the Torah, the law, it consists of 613 commandments. The 10 commandments are just but 10 of the 613. Modern day Jews cannot follow all of those commandments because a lot of them relate to the temple system, the temple cult, and there is no longer a temple. The Romans destroyed it at the end of the first century. Well, we need to stop here, and we'll come back in a little bit.